Thank you, Dr. Spaulding. Sometimes when I follow somebody who has graduated from CMC after me, I think of how some of us blaze paths for greater to follow. But no one can hold a candle to what Matt's been able to achieve here, as well as at the Heritage Foundation over the last 25 years. And we look forward to another couple of decades of promoting liberty as I try and make sure my copy here is not interrupted by Wi-Fi signals. In the interest of some degree of precision, I'm going to do more reading from prepared text than I want. And of course, that's both going to provide some precision, but also avoid some of the questions that will necessarily come up. So I look forward to addressing the unanswered questions about the philosophy behind tariffs and how they interact with liberty during our Q&A period. But one thing we should note is that President Trump's tariffs, as Matt noted, has been roundly attacked from all sides. That in the current economic discourse of the elite, that they're so beyond the pale that even politically diametrically opposed editorial boards such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journals can join forces in condemning this heresy. In fact, one might almost expect that he would have received less opposition from both editorial boards had he renounced his Christianity and denied the divinity of Jesus. Of course, that might have opened him up for some criticisms from some other corners. But this unholy alliance of left and right merely demonstrates how central the idea behind tariffs, the orthodoxy, nay, the dogma of free trade, is to Trump's philosophical challenge to the modernity. The very idea that Trump's acts may have a philosophy at all may strike many as odd. This is not a man who is particularly articulate in advancing ideas of theory. He is somebody who is notoriously transactional when it comes to policy. Witness the shifts on North Korea in the last couple of months, changing his mind on a host of issues with startling speed. Unlike past presidents like Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush, Trump is notably unwilling or unable to comprehensively explain where he wants to take this country. But this does not mean that he lacks such a vision, nor that one exists in our American tradition behind the sort of political economy that he wants to build. In short, that vision, which is implicitly Trump's and explicitly was those of people like Hamilton that Dr. Spaulding spoke of before, rests in an idea of a community and a nation that has fallen into disfavor among elites, particularly those engaged in the study of wealth production on both the left and the right. Americans, in this view, are not simply individuals whose value is determined by consent or market transactions. They are our fellow citizens, people to whom we have an obligation that is separate from their ability to persuade or compel the owners of capital to invest in their lives. When their dreams cannot be fulfilled or their lives are harmed because other Americans make decisions that directly or indirectly harm them, or when direct intervention in some measure, some limited measure, can materially increase their opportunities and the ability to live lives of their own choosing, then according to this philosophy, it's legitimate for government to set things right with such action. As Dr. Spaulding noted, this is far from a novel vision in America. Let's not go back as far as Hamilton. Let's simply start with the mid-19th century. The Whig Party's economic agenda was explicitly centered on this notion. They differed with the Democrats of their day and descended from Jackson and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans precisely over the role of the federal government in the economy. Whigs believed that the federal government, in order to enhance American liberty and prosperity, ought to favor manufacture and building in a national interconnected economy over plantation agriculture and the dislocated local economies that were favored by Democratic Republican or Jacksonian Democratic economic theory. Central to this idea was protective tariffs, that for Whigs believed that would allow American industry to rise. Also central to that idea was subsidized transportation infrastructure, roads and canals at first, what Henry Clay called the American system, and which Abraham Lincoln staunchly supported as a young Whig lawyer and a young Whig politician in Illinois. Railroads, as they became the modus vivendi for speedy transportation between long-distant locations. All this to extend domestic trade throughout the United States and hence bind the Union economically more closely together. Tariffs and transportation bill. Does that sound familiar? Abraham Lincoln shared this view, as I noted, and in fact, the first wholly Republican federal government, the first government that was where the Republican Party held the Senate, the House, and the presidency, enacted their cardinal measures to advance this view in the first Congress that they met. They passed 4 particular measures, each of which embodied this view that government action can enhance economic opportunity and can enhance individual liberty. They passed the Pacific Railroads Act, which subsidized the selection of a transcontinental railroad that would bind East and West. And subsequently, in subsequent Republican administrations, they expanded the subsidy of railroads more generally. The Land-Grant Colleges Act gave federal land or its monetary equivalent to states that established universities that also established programs in agricultural research. MIT, Cornell, and the University of California at Berkeley are only 3 such colleges that are noteworthy today, but owe their creation to the Moral Land-Grant Colleges Act. The Department of Agriculture was also created at this time, a year later, and again, in order to bring the federal government's hand directly behind spreading innovative agricultural research technology to people who otherwise would not be able to obtain it, using the federal government to enhance economic opportunity and liberty. The Homestead Act, the most famous of these acts, subsidized migration to unsettled Western territories by giving away land to the people who cultivated it, in other words, a subsidy. And protective tariffs along the centerpiece of this economic vision allowed domestic manufacturers the space to rise. Nor was this simply a vision of the early Republican Party. Subsequent Republican administrations and congressional leadership adapted these principles to meet the challenges of their age, as we saw large businesses known as trusts or monopolies arise in the later part of the 19th century. The Republican-controlled Congress under the presidency of Benjamin Harrison passed the first Antitrust Act in 1890, precisely to give smaller businesses greater opportunity. When we found that corporations in the production of food or in drugs who were no longer known personally to the people who consumed them, but rather were distant and shipped their packages and shipped their products across interstate lines, were no longer producing things that were inherently safe. The Republican Congress, under the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, passed the Food and Drug Act, which established what would become the FDA, and the Meat Practices Act, which established federal government nationwide inspection of food products to ensure their safety. One of the things I learned when I was researching my book on Ronald Reagan is that in his famous interview with Reason magazine in 1975, one of the points of contention between his interviewer, a noted libertarian and personal friend of mine, and himself was precisely over the FDA, that the libertarian argued it was an improper imposition on individuals, and Ronald Reagan arguing that the FDA was legitimate to protect us from botulism and other foodborne diseases that the individual could not protect himself against through market action. Republican President Dwight Eisenhower also proposed measures that became law with support from both parties that aimed to directly intervene in the economy, most notably the Interstate Highway Act, which created a modern version of Henry Clay's American Way, a way of transportation subsidy that created greater national economic ability and thereby wove the American economy and, through our own migration, the American people more closely together. The view that animates all of these acts is that it carries with it a less materialistic and more spiritual view of what it means to be human. The American can produce something of value, produces far more than the value of the goods or services that he produces. That person produces pride and dignity. Earning enough through one's own efforts to support one's own life vision in the context of the age in which you live is the most basic source of pride for everyone. The great or talented may take pride in other things, such as the ability to best others in competition or build something outside themselves, like a business or creating a work of art. But these more recognized sources of pride, including achievement and pride-inducing achievement, ultimately rest on the most common and basic ability to produce enough of substance to support oneself and one's family according to the nature of the era. Proud people also want to live in proud communities. They take care of their surroundings, both their personal homes and the collective that they share, Like, this has always been a notable source of home ownership among working class people. The people who come to visit note how no matter how poor the areas are, the lawns are usually well kept and the houses well maintained. And then when this is no longer true, one often sees a decline not only in the area, but in the character of the people who inhabit the area. They want clean and safe streets, attractive buildings and open spaces, and even perhaps some expressions of communal pride and aspiration, such as those found in monuments, public buildings, or our common spaces, such as parks. No upper-income suburbanite wants their child going to a school whose windows are broken, or wants to buy goods in a place where shops are boarded up. The same holds true for everyone. In Trump's view, and in the view of many, and especially in the view of millions of voters, our political economy has been hurting millions of Americans for far too long. Trade works into this because the international trade agreements that we have fostered over the last 30 years allow Americans who possess capital, whether that capital is intellectual in the ideas that they have, physical in the things that they own, or monetary, simply shifting money across vast spaces, to contract with foreigners to produce goods or services at vastly lower prices. This system means American factories that cannot compete, and as anyone who's been through the Midwest or areas in the South can tell you, there are many such factories, close or move, and the good-paying jobs that come with those factories dry up. For many people, the value that they possess in the economic sphere comes less from what they bring to the table and more from the machines that they operate. If those machines are now operated by foreigners, the jobs that are left to people of their skills and talent are not necessarily of the same market value, but they remain Americans. The owners of capital benefit enormously. That is what's behind the dramatic increases in incomes among the most educated Americans in the last 30 years, and it's particularly pronounced among the people who work in the investment of finance, that people who are involved in financing these overseas investments are profiting enormously. Americans as consumers benefit as well, too, from the cheaper goods and services that this system creates. But millions, tens of millions of Americans are net losers. Their losses as former producers far exceed their gains as consumers. Nor are these losses merely material. As they lose their jobs through no fault of their own, to quote Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan, their sense of pride suffers, as too many of them lose their jobs all at once. Their communities suffer. They may find other work that pays less and may have their families make do, but their sense of being part of a common endeavor dims. As their communities decline into neglect and disrepair, and anyone who's driven through the back roads off the interstates of the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic know of what I speak. The belief among them that America isn't working for them grows. Current intellectual orthodoxy treats these losses as they might say in the military, collateral damage, the perhaps unfortunate byproducts of an ever-growing, dare one call it, progressive society. The global increase of wealth is valued more by this orthodoxy than the loss of income and pride suffered by their fellow citizens. The dramatic increase in income and life opportunities foreigners obtain through the system, such as the massive decline in absolute poverty throughout the Third World, is touted by these elites as a great achievement. And let us be clear, so it is. But the loss of both dignity and income by their fellow Americans is too often overlooked and ignored. This arises because elites on the right and the left no longer value the sense of nationhood and community that animated the founders and animated all generations of political discussants before the modern era. They no longer believe that community or citizenship hold enough value to give rise to political claims, to even ask for protection of jobs, of income, of the ability to pursue one's dreams is unacceptable in elite discourse. This is especially, I'm afraid, true on the right, where to be called a protectionist is slander in our circles, almost on par with being called a racist. Society progresses through the limitless increase in wealth, they murmur at us. Do you not understand? This view necessarily carries with it an absolutist vision, and may I say ideological vision, of trade and exchange that, if carried to its logical conclusion, undermines the very idea of American nationality. If government ought never to interfere in private voluntary transactions on the grounds that to do so always causes a decline in economic growth, which is, of course, the argument one reads ad nauseum on the Wall Street Journal editorial page with respect to tariffs and trade, then what of any of the acts that I've just read you about that have been part of the national staple of conversation for over 150 years? What of the workplace safety laws that we have come to take for granted? Are they not interferences in the voluntary exchange of goods and material between consenting people? What of workmen's compensation, a mandatory, innovative political compromise that came about between disputes of owners of capital and labor as industrial society created new problems with respect to workplace injury that old common law dictums did not address? The principle advanced by free trade purists in pursuit of their international agenda, in fact, undermines much more than simply international trade. It undermines the very notion of government action in the economy to begin with. This view implicitly treats nationality as either an irrelevant or a subsidiary consideration. It denies that a nation can, in pursuit of a common good, place restrictions upon some of its members to pursue that common good. As such, it subtly undermines, as I stand in front of the expression of Republican self-government itself, the Constitutional Convention, it subtly undermines the idea of Republican self-government itself, which only derives moral validity from the belief that common deliberation and debate can produce a legitimate consensus in support of a common good, which society then works to enact. There are, to be sure, many difficulties with this idea. One can say that the whole idea of natural rights addresses limitations on both the sorts of ends and the types of means that a legitimate Republican government can enact through its deliberative measures. But no one at the founding would have argued that government ought not ever to place limits on or otherwise regulate trade in goods and services. The Constitution itself clearly envisions that, as it explicitly gives Congress the right to regulate trade with foreign nations and among the states, while leaving states with the power to regulate trade within its own borders. And let us make no mistake, those powers were exercised in their respective spheres from the beginning of the founding period. This was not a complete libertarian nirvana prior to the election of Abraham Lincoln. It may be unwise, or as Matt calls it, matters of prudence, to regulate trade in certain manners. Indeed, respect and support for private initiative and property has always been a hallmark of our political economy and ought always to remain a hallmark of our political economy. But the idea that the government ought never to regulate those exchanges is alien itself to that very political economy. The left and right disagree somewhat on how to address these losses that people are suffering in this country, to be sure. Those on the right, unfortunately, tend to ignore any request for redress as improper. If you ask for a subsidy to maintain a standard of living, if you ask for action in order to bring some sort of business to your hometown, if you ask for some sort of requirement that ensures that your child doesn't, or you don't lose access to a doctor, many on the right label you a taker. If you're not building a business or going to college to improve yourself, you're just not worth enough for us to take notice. This, let's not forget, is essentially a denial of the dictum that all men, all Americans, have equal worth and dignity. It's no accident that the very people who flocked to Donald Trump that made what was called the blue Midwestern wall red turned their backs on the Romney-Ryan ticket. Nor is it surprising when we look at their entire history of going back since the industrial age. The Republican Party was once the party of immigrants. It was once the party of the blue-collar worker. It was that party when the system of Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln's political economy ruled the day. It was the time when you could go to Chicago and meet Republican mayors, when Republican candidates carried Pittsburgh, and when miners and loggers voted for the party of the elephant. That ended with the Great Depression, when Herbert Hoover argued that nothing in the Constitution allowed him to directly intervene in the economy on the scale that would prevent or even begin to seriously ameliorate the suffering that was felt by over half of America's people. They then turned their backs on the party of the elephant, on the party that once promised a full dinner pail, and turned to the Democrats. And since that time, they have continued to support the party that adopts the sort of principles that Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln adopt: one that allows for free action and free enterprise and the ability of the ambitious to move up, while also providing sufficient protection so that the gains from trade are fairly shared and that all people of all talents can live dignified lives of their choosing. They will back Republicans who support these principles, even as they offer wildly different interpretations of them than their more liberal or progressive foes. Dwight Eisenhower used to say, when he talked about how he approaches, that he was a liberal in human matters but a conservative in fiscal matters, which meant that he was willing to have a limited expansion of some degrees of government involvement, certainly never government ownership or government direction. Ronald Reagan himself was somebody who never rejected these ideas. And as I argue very clearly in my book, the way that you can understand Reagan's movement from being an ardent backer of Franklin Roosevelt to being what he became was precisely that he never abandoned the idea that people ought to have a hand up in American life, but not a handout. He was an interpreter, a radical interpreter, to be sure, but an interpreter, not an opponent of this principle. The left tends to fail in a way that's even more problematic. It does so by looking at these people, at our citizens, at our fellow neighbors, as merely material beings. To them, the problem is lack of money. Consequently, increased government subsidies, particularly through checks sent by the government, things like uniform basic income or enhanced minimum wage hikes or other forms of direct monetary alleviation, will solve the problem. But the fact is, neither solution confers the pride that comes from a job, nor does either solution address the system that places these people under a continual competition that they simply cannot win. They are merely palliatives, a hospice, if you will, that ease the suffering of the body but ignore the suffering of the soul and overlook the possible death of both. Trump's solutions, which are identical to the Republican platform of 1928 and 1932, tariffs and immigration restriction, ring true to many Trump voters because they directly address what they perceive as the causes of their problems. My research showed that years before Trump ever showed up on the stage, if you ask people who were the sort of person who switched from Obama to Trump, what they thought about trade and what they thought about Wall Street, they endorsed, and immigration, they endorsed exactly the positions that Donald Trump mirrored back at them 4 years later when he came down the escalator at his Trump Tower. Such direct action, however, has the additional, perhaps even the decisive benefit of telling these voters, telling these Americans that they matter. Just as one derives pride from living in a well-kept local community, so one also derives pride from living in a country that recognizes and even perhaps exalts your values as their own. For many of these people, that, more than any immediate or tangible increase in their income, is what will make America great again. I'm often asked by the left, people on the left, well, what if these voters what if they don't see things improve? What if Trump's ideas don't deliver? And I've come to realize that as long as they aren't moving backward, as long as Trump is delivering reassurance, as long as Trump is delivering a belief that they are part of this fight, that they are part of the American discussion, which they've not felt for a very long time, they will stay with him, because that is what they value. Now, tariffs may not produce the desired results in increasing job numbers. Shrinking international trade may very well produce a shrinking global economy that causes Americans to lose jobs and become poorer. They may be a bad means to enact a proper end. But on the other hand, tariffs may be simply a precursor to a deal that spreads the gains from increasing wealth in international trade more evenly between foreign labor, capital, and American labor. That's what Ronald Reagan's trade-era restrictions did in many, many ways. And while we tend to remember Ronald Reagan as a free trader, and that is certainly true, he loved free trade and advanced free trade agreements and was, in fact, the father of the idea that became NAFTA, announcing that what he called a North American Common Market in his introductory address when he became entered into the 1980 presidential race. In government, Ronald Reagan frequently deviated from free trade purist ideological orthodoxy. He pushed the Japanese to adopt voluntary export restraints on automobiles, voluntarily adopted quotas under the threat that if you didn't do it yourself, the Congress might force us to do it on you. He pushed for the same idea on machine tools. He created limits on semiconductor imports when they were threatening to destroy the American high-tech industry in its infancy. He allowed for the creation and overlooking the possible violation of antitrust laws to allow semiconductor companies to pool their resources for research and a consideration called semitech. And perhaps most importantly, in a way that we can understand in our daily life, he saved Harley-Davidson Motorcycle Company. And this is a story that I'm going to tell a little more in detail because it's one that he tells in detail in his autobiography, An American Life. That in the early 1980s, as he says, the executive Harley-Davidson came to him and said that they couldn't compete with unfairly subsidized and unfairly promoted Japanese motorcycle imports. If they gave them 2 years, however, through sanctions on and import quotas on the Japanese motorcycles, they could retool their company and compete. And Reagan's telling, he complied and they complied. And as Reagan says, 1 year later they came back and said, we finished the job earlier, you can take the sanctions off now. So Reagan did take the sanctions off, and in his book he talks about pride of how his actions saved an American company because he believed that with fair competition, no one could outproduce the American worker. So every time you look at a Harley-Davidson and picture and television or running down the street, remember that company exists today because Ronald Reagan violated free trade orthodoxy to ensure that Americans of all backgrounds had a fair stake in American life. But in a very important sense, economics is not the way that we should measure the success of these provisions. It is certainly an important way. It is a crucial way, but is not necessarily the decisive way that we should engage success of this. That is because so-called populist movements throughout the world are gaining strength precisely because their voters no longer feel valued members of their nations. And we can see this in things like Brexit, in the way that the Italian voters continually have thumbed their noses at the bipartisan elite that wanted to curry favor with Brussels. We can see it in a host of political parties that are gaining strength in Europe. That they do not believe their worth should decline because the owners of capital say so, or that because of the lords of business say so, or that the lords of the media or the politics say so. Nor do they think that their life dreams or values should be denigrated simply because the educated, most educated, have different visions. Populists overseas tend also, if not to be highly religious like Americans, tend to be more socially conservative and less comfortable with the enforced drift towards social progressivism that is too often advanced without consideration by the elites in their capitals. Populists like Trump address this spiritual yearning and fulfill the deepest need every human has, to be valued and to belong to a group that values you. In this, and perhaps in this sense alone, all men are truly created equal. Tariffs are simply an economic means to fulfill this spiritual need. Tariffs opponents can only win if they first recognize this need and recognize its legitimate rooting in the American political and constitutional tradition and promise a more effective way to fulfill it. There are many ways that we can adopt that can give people the private sector jobs they crave and thereby give them the pride and dignity that they deserve. Things like increased vocational technical education. In Germany and Switzerland, their programs have ensured that people of lesser skills still get jobs in today's economy, as opposed to America's system that tells people that if you don't go to college, you're a failure, and then sets up millions of people for whom succeeding at college is merely a pipe dream for failure in dropping out, failure in student loans they can't repay, and failure in jobs that they can never fill. Perhaps a more effective vocational education program will do more to restore America's sense of community and to restore some of these problems than tariffs ever will. Mobility grants, or what I call in one article a new Homestead Act. People are trapped in job deserts by a host of things, some of them private, such as home values that they have declined below what they pay for them. They simply cannot afford to move to places with greater opportunity. Or in many cases, government programs, that if you're on unemployment insurance, you are neither told about nor encouraged to look for jobs outside of a 50 or 75-mile radius of your hometown. In many places, there aren't those jobs within 50 or 75 miles. There may be jobs 500 or 750 miles away. You may need to move from northern Michigan to southern Texas. But there's nothing that the government does when they provide help that tells you about this, and that subtly encourages people to stay put. Mobility grants, information, and other things that would make benefits portable across state lines can encourage people to move in pursuit of opportunity, to move as the people in the 1870s and 1880s did from the ports of the East to the lands of the West, so that they can provide for themselves, and that consequently can derive that pride that comes from an honest day work in pursuit of an honest job. If, however, tariff opponents do this, then Trump has already won, because the battle is not over tariffs, the battle is over this. Because in order to do this, you have to recognize the common humanity, the common nationality, the common citizenship of America. You have to abandon the materialistic view that says only goods of the body count. You must recognize that goods of the soul, that human equality counts too, and that that's part of the legitimate political discourse. And that view is a very American and a very conservative view. Let me close with some thoughts about the greatest Americans and the greatest Republicans and the greatest conservatives, Abraham Lincoln and Ronald Reagan. That Lincoln said in an undated fragment that his definition of democracy was simple, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. In that view, liberation of the slaves, political liberty, a free market economy, and an active but limited government program to ensure that those gains are spread and encouraged evenly are not in discrete elements. They are part of a single unified worldview, that as I would not be a slave that is dependent on someone else, so I would not be a master who forces that person to work in a way that injures their pride, dignity, and ability to provide for themselves. All men are created equal in this way, because then all people are given the legitimate opportunity to pursue their talents. And this, I believe, is what Lincoln meant when he extolled government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But for our modern age, let's consider the greatest conservative of our lifetime, Ronald Reagan. If you go to visit his grave in the sunny hills of Southern California, where almost out of central casting at his funeral, he was buried to a cloudless, sunlit sky at sunset, you will find his last thoughts, the words he meant to have us remember him by. They are not from one of his greatest speeches. You will not read some of the great words that he spoke in his endorsement of Barry Goldwater, nor will you read some of the great words that he delivered at the Westminster Address, nor will you see that he was the person who brought down the Berlin Wall through his staunch defense of freedom at a time when the West was wavering. Rather, you will read what I believe to be the core of his philosophy, and that is simple, and it is profound, but it is not what we might expect. What that epitaph says is that I believe in my heart that man is good, that what is right will eventually triumph, and that there is worth and purpose to each and every human life. A political economy that adopts that as its central creed is one that respects the dignity of freedom, but also respects the dignity of the soul. It is one that, as Ronald Reagan believed, one that enhanced the maximum degree of ordered liberty that is possible in the human society, but not a disordered liberty that comes from an unordered, a non-structured, a non-political liberty. And so, too, I think that is our choice today. We are faced with a battle of twin materialisms that view people very differently than the founders did. They are people who will ask us to consider our human value as reducible either to what the state tells us or what the owners of capital tells us. And it is against that view that Americans must fight. It is against that view that Donald Trump is fighting. And if we are successful in this victory, if we are successful in reclaiming our legitimate political inheritance, if we are successful in reclaiming our own political tradition, then we can, as Ronald Reagan would tell us, rest happy because we will have restored America as the last great hope of man on earth. Thank you.